The gates of the Pennsylvania State Penitentiary creaked open. Hugo Dickens took his first step toward freedom after 10 years in prison. The April sun dazzled him, making him squint. He took a deep breath of the fresh air, which seemed almost painfully clean after the mustiness of the prison cells. He was wearing the same clothes in which he had been arrested 10 years ago, jeans that now hung over a slimmer body, and a plaid shirt yellowed by time. In his hands was a tattered paper bag with a few personal items. "Mr. Dickens, your papers." The guard held out the envelope. "Good luck out there." Hugo nodded silently. Good luck. In 10 years, he'd learned that luck was a luxury he could no longer afford. Now, all he had was purpose. He walked slowly down the road leading away from the prison. When the gate was finally out of sight, Hugo stopped and sank to the ground. His shoulders trembled, but there were no tears. He had used them up long ago, in his 3rd year of imprisonment, when he finally realized that he would never get justice. The day of his arrest came to mind, May 22nd, 2015. He had come home early from work and found 2 policemen at his door. Rosalind stood beside them, tears streaming down her face, leaving black streaks of mascara. An actress, a bloody actress. "Hugo Dickens, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of George Martinez," one of the officers pronounced, snapping the handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't realize what was going on. George Martinez was a local businessman, owner of the construction company where Hugo worked. They'd never been close, but neither had any conflicts between them. "There must be some mistake," was all he could mutter at the time. But there was no mistake. He was on trial for cold-blooded murder for robbery. The key witnesses were his own wife, Rosalind, and his best friend, David Collins. In the courtroom, Rosalind, sobbing, told how Hugo came home in a rage, how he often spoke hatefully of his boss, how he hid money from her, and how on the night of the murder he returned with bloody hands and told her to keep quiet. Every word was a lie. He did stay late that night, but not because of the murder, but because he was helping David move into a new apartment. It's ironic. David, whom he trusted as himself, confirmed Rosalind's version of events. What's more, he claimed that Hugo confessed the murder to him, showed him the money stolen from Martinez, and asked him to keep quiet. "I couldn't live with that burden," David told the jury, looking anywhere but at Hugo. "As hard as it was for me to betray a friend, I couldn't become an accessory to murder." The prosecutor presented a series of pieces of evidence: a bloody baseball bat with Hugo's fingerprints found near the crime scene, his hair at the murder scene, an anonymous call to police reporting his involvement. Everything pointed to Hugo, and only Hugo knew he was innocent. The defense was weak. The court-appointed defense attorney seemed more interested in wrapping up the case as quickly as possible than in finding the truth. No one had properly checked Hugo's alibi. His version that he had helped David on the night of the murder was refuted by David himself, saying that they had indeed been together, but earlier, and Hugo had left hours before the murder, clearly agitated. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. Guilty. The sentence was 15 years in prison. Hugo got up and continued walking. The town of Chester, where the prison was located, wasn't too big, and he soon reached the bus station. He had almost no money, only the meager sums he had managed to earn from prison work and savings. It was enough for a ticket to Allentown. On the bus, Hugo reflected on how his life had changed. 10 years ago, he had everything: a beloved wife, a faithful friend, a good job, plans for the future. Now he had nothing but memories and bitterness, and suspicions, which over the years of imprisonment had turned into firm certainties. He couldn't understand why Rosalind and David had lied. Why were his wife and best friend suddenly united against him? What was it that bound them together? For the first few years in prison, he tried to find a logical explanation for their behavior. Maybe they were intimidated. Maybe they had been threatened. But gradually these excuses melted away, giving way to darker speculations. It was in his 7th year of incarceration that he met Thomas Green. The elderly man with a life sentence seemed harmless, but he was respected and feared in prison. "You have the eyes of a man who knows he's been betrayed," Thomas told him once in the mess hall. Hugo remained silent at the time, but the remark was the beginning of a strange friendship. Thomas had connections both inside and outside the prison. He collected information like a collector collects rare stamps, methodically and with loving attention to detail. "I can help you find out the truth," Thomas offered after a few months of their acquaintance. "But are you ready to hear it?" Hugo was ready. By then, he was no longer interested in the possibility of acquittal or parole. All he wanted was to understand why the people he loved had taken his life. Thomas began to gather information. He had contacts with inmates from other prisons, with lawyers, even with some police officers. Slowly, bit by bit, a picture of what had happened was emerging. The first thing Hugo learned was that Rosalind did not suffer after his arrest. Just a month after the trial, she sold their house and moved to a more upscale neighborhood in Allentown. She opened a fashion boutique that quickly became popular with the local elite. For a woman whose husband had just gotten 15 years in prison for murder, she led an overly active and carefree life. David, too, had turned his life around. Previously a humble clerk in an office, he suddenly became a financial consultant in a prestigious company. He bought a new car, expensive clothes, and what hurt Hugo the most was that David and Rosalind were now together. Making no secret of their relationship, they appeared at every city event as a couple. "Obviously there was something going on between them even before your arrest," Thomas remarked, as he watched Hugo silently digest this information. "Why didn't they just divorce me? Why would they set me up?" That question tormented Hugo more than anything else. Thomas promised to find out more, but warned that it might take time. And time did indeed pass, slowly and agonizingly. Each day in prison was like the last. Hugo worked in the prison workshop, worked out in the gym, and read the books Thomas brought. Outwardly, he seemed resigned to his fate as a prisoner, but within him a determination grew. And then, 2 years after they met, Thomas brought important news. Through a former cellmate with connections in the Allentown underworld, he had learned of a strange coincidence. A few weeks before Martinez's murder, a certain professional assassin had appeared in town. He had fulfilled the order and disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. "It could just be a coincidence," Hugo said then, unwilling to give vent to hope. "There are no coincidences in our business," Thomas objected. "I'll keep digging." And he did. Months passed. Hugo filed petitions for reconsideration, but they were all denied. The justice system was deaf to his claims of innocence, but Thomas didn't give up. He used all his connections to gather more information about the night of the murder, about Rosalind, about David, about the unexpected wealth that had fallen upon them. The bus stopped at the Allentown station. Hugo got off looking around. The town had changed in 10 years, but the basic landmarks remained the same. He headed for a cheap motel on the outskirts where he could stay without attracting attention. On his first night out, Hugo couldn't sleep. He lay on the hard bed, looking up at the ceiling and remembering the last conversation he'd had with Thomas before his release. "What are you going to do when you get out?" Thomas asked. "Find the truth," Hugo replied. "I need to know for sure." "The truth can be painful," Thomas warned. "Sometimes it's better to put the past behind you and start a new life." But Hugo knew he couldn't start a new life until he closed the old chapter. Too many questions left unanswered. Too much pain had accumulated over the years. The next day, he began his investigation. Hugo's first order of business was to go to Rosalind's boutique. "Rose and Thorns," read the store's ornate sign on Hamilton Street. He took a position in the cafe across the street and waited. At noon, he saw her, still beautiful, but more groomed and confident. Rosalinda got out of a black Mercedes with shopping bags and disappeared into the store. An hour later, another car drove up to the boutique, and David got out of it. He too had changed, an expensive suit, a stylish haircut, an expensive watch on his wrist. Well-being literally oozed from his every pore. Hugo squeezed the coffee cup so hard that it cracked. The hot liquid burned his fingers, but he barely noticed the pain. It was the first time in 10 years he'd seen them in person, not the pictures Thomas had handed him. The sense of unreality of what was happening mingled with the pain of betrayal that never seemed to subside. Over the next few days, Hugo studied their routines. Rosalind and David lived in a large house in an upscale West End neighborhood. Every morning, David left for the office around 8 o'clock and returned after 6. Rosalind would open the boutique by 10 o'clock and close around 7 in the evening. They dined together at an Italian restaurant on Tuesdays, went to the local theater on Fridays, and met friends at the country club on weekends. A happy, carefree life. And that life was built on his suffering, his life that had been taken from him. Watching their house one evening, Hugo noticed that security was minimal. A simple alarm system, no security cameras. They didn't expect danger. Why should they be concerned? Their victim was safely tucked away behind bars for years to come. Or so they thought. Thomas had given him a small amount of money before his release, for the first time, and the contact of a man in Allentown who could help him with jobs and housing. But for now, Hugo preferred to stay in the shadows. He switched motels, paid cash, and used a baseball cap and sunglasses to hide his face. No one had to know that Hugo Dickens was back in town. As time went on, he noticed that things were not smooth sailing in their relationship. One day he witnessed their quarrel outside the boutique. David something hotly argued to Rosalinda, waving his hands. She stared at him coldly, and then abruptly turned and walked away into the store. David stood for another minute and then got into his car and drove away, accelerating sharply. Another time, while watching their house in the evening, Hugo heard the clinking of broken glass and screaming. A few minutes later, David left the house, slammed the door, and drove away. He didn't return until near morning, drunk and barely on his feet. "Trouble in paradise?" Hugo muttered, watching the scene from his car. Some part of him felt satisfaction at their troubles, but the other part, the part that still remembered what it was like to be human, felt only emptiness. One day, while following David, Hugo discovered that he was making regular visits to the lawyer's office. It was strange. Why would a successful financial advisor want to see a lawyer so often? Hugo decided to find out more. Using the contacts provided by Thomas, he was able to obtain information that David and Rosalind had recently updated their wills. Moreover, they were involved in some kind of legal proceedings, the details of which were still unknown. Hugo carefully wrote down all these facts in the notebook he had bought especially for his investigation. He did not know what he was looking for, but he felt that every detail could be important. One day, sitting in his hotel room and going through the notes, Hugo realized that it was time to be more proactive. Surveillance had given him insight into their daily routines, but it didn't get him any closer to answering the main questions. Why had they betrayed him? Was Martinez's murder planned by them? And if so, why? He decided to start at their house. The following Friday, when they went to the theater as usual, Hugo broke into their property. Security was minimal. Alarms on the doors and windows on the first floor, but the small window to the basement wasn't wired to it. A typical mistake of expensive homeowners who are overconfident about their security. Inside the house, Hugo moved cautiously. He didn't want to steal or damage anything. His goal was David's home office. It wasn't hard to find, a large room on the second floor with a massive desk and a wall of diplomas and certificates. Hugo began methodically going through the documents. In the top drawer of the desk, he found a folder of bank statements. The amounts in the accounts were impressive hundreds of thousands of dollars. For a man who 10 years ago had been a simple clerk, this was unexpected wealth. Another drawer contained deeds to a house, cars, shares in various companies. All of these had been acquired within the last 10 years. But the most interesting thing Hugo found in a safe that was hidden behind a painting. The code turned out to be simple. Rosalind's date of birth, which Hugo remembered, of course. In the safe was a folder labeled Martinez. Hugo's heart beat faster. He opened it and began to read. Inside were George Martinez's estate papers, a copy of his will, and a list of beneficiaries, among them the name of Hugo Dickens. Before he could realize the significance of this discovery, Hugo heard the sound of the front door opening. They were back sooner than he had expected. Quickly putting the folder back in the safe and locking it, Hugo silently left the office and went down to the first floor. Rosalind and David's voices came from the living room. They were clearly arguing. "I can't go on like this! You promised it would be easy!" Rosalind's voice shook with rage. "And now these lawyers say they might start a new investigation." "Calm down," replied David sharply. "There won't be any investigation. They don't have anything concrete." Hugo froze in the shadows of the hallway, afraid to move. He couldn't miss this conversation. What if they find something? If they come out on Carlos? Rosalind sounded almost hysterical. Carlos is dead. How many times do I have to tell you? He died a month after everything. No one will find anything. Hugo smiled in the darkness. Carlos. A name at last. And it looked like Thomas was right. There was a real killer. With that name, he would be able to find more information. Taking advantage of the fact that the couple had moved into the kitchen, continuing to argue, Hugo slipped out the same basement window. Back at the motel, he wrote down everything he'd learned. Carlos's name, mention of some new investigation, and most importantly, the fact that he was in Martinez's will. He never knew about it. Did it mean that Martinez had bequeathed him the money? And if so, did Rosalind receive it after his arrest? The answers to these questions could explain the motive. But Hugo needed proof, not just conjecture. He decided to continue his surveillance and gather more information before taking the next step. Days merged into weeks. Hugo watched their every move, studied their habits, their surroundings. He learned that David often met some man in a bar on the outskirts of town. They sat in a far corner and talked so quietly that Hugo couldn't hear a word. Rosalind, for her part, seemed increasingly tense. One day she even cried in her boutique, and the consultant had to close the store early. Something was happening in their lives, something that made them nervous. And Hugo was determined to find out what it was. One evening when David went to his usual bar after work, Hugo decided to follow him. Seated at a nearby table, he watched David nervously tapping his fingers on his whiskey glass, obviously waiting for someone. Finally, the door opened, and a middle-aged man in an austere suit entered the bar. He sat down across from David, and they began to talk. Hugo couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see David's face tense, the way he looked around every now and then, as if afraid of being overheard. The meeting lasted no more than 20 minutes. The man left first, and David remained seated, finishing his whiskey and ordering another. Hugo decided to follow the stranger. He followed him out of the bar and saw him get into an unremarkable gray car. On the back window was a sticker from a local law firm, The Lawyer. David regularly met with the lawyer at the bar, not at the office. It was odd and suggested that they were discussing something that shouldn't have made it into the official records. Back at the motel, Hugo added this information to his notes. The picture was slowly taking shape, but many details were still missing. He couldn't act on mere speculation. He needed facts, proof. And he continued his surveillance, patiently waiting for the moment when he could learn the whole truth about the betrayal that had cost him 10 years of his life. 3 weeks after his release, Hugo prepared a small apartment on the outskirts of Allentown. The walls were hung with photographs, notes, newspaper clippings, everything he had collected in the meantime. The centerpiece was a large map of the city, with the places Rosalind and David had visited regularly marked on it. Red threads connected the photos with places and dates. From the outside, it looked like the work of an obsessive, but to Hugo, it was a system. The last conversation overheard in their house kept him on his toes. The name Carlos had become the key that could open the door to the truth. Using the contacts provided by Thomas, Hugo began his search. Carlos. He didn't know the last name, but there were several Carlos with questionable reputations in the Allentown underworld 10 years ago. The meeting had taken place in an abandoned warehouse in an industrial area. Ramon, former street gang member and current informant, looked around nervously. "Carlos Vasquez," he said, accepting an envelope of money. "Professional hitman from Philadelphia. Came to Allentown in the spring of 2015. Did the job and disappeared." "What job?" Hugo tried to speak calmly, though his heart was pounding like crazy. "Took out some rich businessman. I don't know exactly, but I heard he was paid very well. It was an unusual order, not just to kill, but to frame someone." "What happened to him afterward?" "Died. A month after the job, OD'd. Although," Ramon lowered his voice, "some say he had help, knew too much." That information was enough to move on to the next step. Hugo needed proof that Rosalind and David had paid Carlos to kill Martinez. He realized that if such evidence existed, it could only be in their house. The next chance came when the couple went to New York City for the weekend. Hugo watched their house from the moment they left to make sure no one was coming. At night, he'd sneaked inside again through the basement window. This time, he had more time. He searched David's office thoroughly, examining every document, checking every folder. In one of the desk drawers, he found an old notebook. It contained entries from 10 years ago, names, phone numbers, dates of meetings. Hugo flipped through the pages until he found an entry dated May 10th, 2015, 12 days before Martinez's murder. K, 8 p.m., docks. Next to that entry was a number, 50,000. Hugo photographed the page on the cell phone he'd bought specifically for his investigation. The next discovery was a bank statement hidden in an old shoebox on the top shelf of a closet. A cash withdrawal, $50,000 on May 11th, 2015. Another photograph. But the most valuable find was a flash drive hidden in a stash behind the bookcase. Hugo inserted it into his laptop and found several photos and documents. Among them was a scanned copy of George Martinez's will, dated a month before his death. It stated in black and white that 1/3 of Martinez's estate, about $3 million, would go to Hugo Dickens, a man of exceptional moral character and potential. The next document caused Hugo to stiffen with shock. It was a letter from Martinez to Hugo, which he never received. In it, the businessman explained his decision to bequeath a significant portion of his fortune to him and offered to be his partner in the business. "I am confident that you can bring fresh ideas and energy to the company," Martinez wrote. "Come to my office on Monday, and we will discuss the details." Monday, the day Martinez was killed. Everything fell into place. Martinez saw potential in him and was going to make him not only a wealthy heir, but a partner in business. Rosalind and David found out about it. They decided to get rid of Martinez and set up Hugo to get his inheritance. The wife would legally get her husband's money while serving time for murder. Hugo copied all the files onto his laptop. Now he had proof, but he also realized that it would be difficult to get justice legally. Too much time had passed. Too few witnesses remained. He was ready for the next step. It was mid-May, almost exactly 10 years since his life had been shattered. Hugo knew that every Tuesday, Rosalind and David had dinner at an Italian restaurant and then returned home around 10 o'clock at night. He decided it was the perfect time. The preparations were meticulous. Hugo had bought everything he needed from various stores, paying only in cash: black gloves, a mask, a change of clothes. He wasn't going to hide after what he planned to do, but he wanted to control the situation until the end. At 9:30 p.m., he was already at their house, having entered through the same basement window. This time he didn't go upstairs, but settled in the living room, in a chair with his back to the front door. That way they wouldn't notice him immediately when they came in. At 10:15, he heard the sound of a car pulling up. The doors slammed, and voices were heard. Rosalind and David arguing about something as usual. The sound of a key in the lock, the creak of the door opening. "I'm telling you, we need to sell the house and move." David's voice sounded strained. "Those lawyers won't let up." "I'm not going anywhere," Rosalind replied sharply. "You promised that everything would be fine, that we would live like kings, and now we have to run away?" They passed into the living room without turning on the light. Hugo could hear David pouring himself a drink. "Calm down. We'll be fine. We just have to be careful. Hugo will be out soon, and if he starts digging..." "Hugo's already here," Dickens said calmly, turning on the desk lamp next to the chair. Rosalind cried out in surprise. David froze with his glass in his hand, his face turning white. "Hello, dears," Hugo continued without getting up from his chair. "I'm back." How did you get here?" David was the first to come to his senses. "That's not important. What matters is that we can finally talk, really talk." Hugo rose slowly. "About George Martinez, about the will, about Carlos Vasquez." Rosalind went pale and grabbed the back of the couch for support. David took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about," he tried to object, but his voice shook. "You do know, David. Just like Rosalind knows." Hugo pulled a flash drive out of his pocket. "It's all here. Proof that you hired an assassin to get rid of Martinez and frame me, all because of $3 million and the place in the business he was going to offer me." "That's the ravings of a madman." Rosalind finally found her voice. David, call the police. He's trespassing in our house. Call them, Hugo agreed calmly. I'm ready for anything. The question is, are you ready? Are you ready for me to show them this? He held up the flash drive. Or tell them you're discussing fleeing the city. Or mention the name Carlos Vasquez. What do you think will happen if they start digging? Even if I end up behind bars again, don't you think I'll find a way to get the information where it belongs? David and Rosalind looked over at each other. Hugo could see the fear on their faces. Not just fear of him, but fear of exposure, of the collapse of their carefully constructed lives. What do you want? David asked quietly. The truth. I want to hear the truth first, from both of you. A heavy pause hung. Finally, Rosalind sank down on the sofa, her shoulders slumped. It was my idea, she admitted. Yeah, I happened to see a letter from Martinez to you. Told David about it. We realized that you were going to be rich and we'd be left with nothing. Nothing? Hugo interjected. We had a house, a job, each other. Isn't that enough? For us, yes, David interjected. We've been together a long time, behind your back, for several years. Hugo felt something inside him finally snap. All these years, he'd thought their betrayal had been a sudden decision dictated by greed, but they'd been betraying him for years. Go on. His voice sounded muffled. We didn't plan the murder, Rosalind added quickly. At first, we just wanted to discredit you in front of Martinez in some way. But then David found out about the will, about those millions, and we decided this was our chance. Carlos Vasquez is a former client of mine, David admitted. He dealt not only with murders but also with various services. We paid him to kill Martinez and leave evidence pointing to you. And then you killed him too, Hugo said affirmatively. David shuddered. It was an accident. We just wanted to make sure he wouldn't tell anyone. Gave him an extra dose. He was a junkie. No one would have investigated. 10 years, Hugo said slowly. You took 10 years of my life, for money. We didn't think you'd get that long, Rosalind objected. 5 years at the most, we were told, but your lawyer was so incompetent. Because you paid him, Hugo finished for her. Rosalind lowered her eyes. That was the only confirmation he needed. Now what? David asked. The money? You want money? We can make a deal. Hugo shook his head slowly. Not everything in this life can be bought, David. For example, you can't buy forgiveness, or 10 years of life. He pulled a gun from his pocket. Not a cheap and unreliable one, but a good one. An army Beretta, which he'd acquired through the same channels he'd used to gather information. Hugo, no! Rosalind shrieked, jumping up from the couch. Sit down, he commanded, and something in his voice made her obey. Look. David held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Let's talk about this. We can make a deal. You'll get money, lots of money. You'll start a new life. A new life? Hugo grinned bitterly. Do you really think that's possible? After everything you've done to me? Then what do you want? Rosalind exclaimed in despair. Justice, Hugo answered simply. The first shot sounded like thunder in the quiet living room. David clutched his stomach and slowly settled to the floor, his eyes wide with shock. Rosalind screamed and rushed for the exit, but Hugo was faster. He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her back. You're not going anywhere, he whispered in her ear. We haven't finished our conversation. The next 2 hours turned into a nightmare for both of them. Hugo took his time. He wanted them to feel at least some of the pain he had felt all these years. Physical pain was only a small part of his plan. Much more important to him was their psychological suffering, the realization of inevitability, the horror of waiting, the realization that they had nowhere to run and no one would come to their aid. David died first, from loss of blood and multiple wounds. His last words were, I'm sorry, but Hugo knew that this was not sincere remorse, but only an attempt to save his life. Rosalind held on longer. She begged, she cried. She tried to manipulate his feelings by bringing up their past, but the past no longer existed. It had been destroyed by their betrayal. Why? Hugo asked, looking down at her. Why did you betray me? We could have been happy together. I never loved you, she exhaled, looking into his eyes with sudden clarity. You were comfortable, dependable. You were boring. That admission didn't shock him the way it might have 10 years ago. It only confirmed what he already knew in the back of his mind. The last shot rang out at midnight. Hugo stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the results of his revenge. He felt not triumph or satisfaction, but a strange desolation. All these years he had lived with thoughts of retribution, and now that it had been accomplished, there was only emptiness inside. He laid out neatly on the coffee table all the evidence he'd collected. Printouts of bank statements, photographs of David's notebook entries, a copy of Martinez's will, the letter he'd never received. Next to it, he put a handwritten confession detailing how Rosalind and David had orchestrated Martinez's murder and framed him. Hugo then sat back in his chair and dialed the police number. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher answered. My name is Hugo Dickens. I've just killed 2 people, Rosalind Dickens and David Collins. The address is Cedar Crest Boulevard, 243. I'll wait inside for the police. He hung up the phone and closed his eyes. Now all that was left to do was wait. Detective Lucia Garretton arrived on the scene 20 minutes after the first patrolman. By then, the house was already cordoned off, and Hugo was sitting handcuffed in a police car. What do we got? She asked, approaching the officer on duty. Double homicide. Victims are male and female, presumably spouses. Suspect called the police on his own and turned himself in. Says it's revenge for them setting him up 10 years ago. Lucia nodded and headed toward the house. Inside, a team of experts were working, taking pictures and gathering evidence. The crime scene was horrific. Blood on the walls, on the furniture, on the floor. The victims were mutilated beyond recognition. This isn't just a murder, she muttered. This is an execution. One of the officers approached her with a folder in his hands. Detective, you need to see this. The suspect left this on the table. It looks like evidence of some kind of conspiracy. Lucia took the folder and quickly looked through the contents. With each document, her eyebrows rose higher and higher. Check all of this, she ordered. Every detail, and contact the archives. I need the George Martinez murder case from 10 years ago. She left the house and walked over to the police car where Hugo was sitting. He looked calm, almost detached. Mr. Dickens, I'm Detective Lucia Garretton. May I ask you a few questions? Hugo raised a tired look at her. Of course, Detective. I'm all yours. Do you realize what you've done? Yes. I killed 2 people, Rosalind Dickens, my ex-wife, and David Collins, a former friend of mine. Why? They organized the murder of George Martinez 10 years ago and framed me. I served 10 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. All the evidence is on the table in the living room. Lucia looked at him carefully. Even if that's true, Mr. Dickens, it doesn't give you the right to lynch me. I know, he nodded. I'm not looking for an excuse. I made a choice and I'm prepared to answer for it. You will be taken to the station for formal questioning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. I understand all that, Detective, Hugo interrupted her, and I won't deny my guilt. The only thing I ask is that you scrutinize the evidence I left behind. Not for my sake, I've already accepted my fate, but for the sake of the truth. Lucia nodded, making no promises. She had seen many criminals, many of them making up excuses for their actions. But something in this man's eyes made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to his story. The Allentown police station hadn't changed in the 10 years Hugo hadn't seen it. The same gray walls, the same smell of coffee and disinfectant, the same fluorescent lights mercilessly emphasizing the fatigue on the faces of the cops. Hugo sat in the interrogation room, his hands shackled in handcuffs that were fastened to a metal table. He had not resisted arrest, nor had he tried to escape. His mission had been accomplished, and now he was ready to accept the consequences. The door opened, and Detective Lucia Garretton entered. She placed a thick folder on the desk and sat down across from Hugo. Her dark hair was gathered into a severe bun, and her attentive eyes studied his face as if trying to read his mind. Mr. Dickens, I'm Detective Lucia Garretton, she began in a formal tone. Do you understand your rights? Yes, Detective. I waive my right to an attorney, and I am prepared to answer all of your questions. Garretton nodded and turned on the tape recorder lying on the desk. Recording of the interrogation of suspect Hugo Dickens. Date: May 16th, 2025. Year: time, 1 hour and 15 minutes. AM present, Detective Lucia Garrison, suspect Hugo Dickens. Mr. Dickens, do you knowingly waive the presence of counsel? Yes, I am waiving counsel. Good. Tell us in your own words what happened tonight. Hugo took a deep breath. I killed Rosalind Dickens and David Collins, shot them and left evidence of their involvement in the murder of George Martinez, for which I served 10 years. Why did you do that? Because they ruined my life. They orchestrated Martinez's murder and set me up to get hold of the money he bequeathed me and get rid of me. Start over, Garrison suggested. Tell the whole story. And Hugo began to tell it, about his life before his arrest. A simple, happy life as a construction worker with a loving wife and a loyal friend. About how Martinez, the owner of the construction company, noticed his potential and decided to make him his partner and heir. About how he was arrested on false charges of Martinez's murder, and how his wife and best friend testified against him. About the 10 years in prison, where the only thing that kept him going was the hope of someday learning the truth. He told of meeting Thomas Green, a life sentence inmate who helped him gather information about the real perpetrators of the crime, about his release and following Rosalind and David, about how he'd gathered evidence of their guilt, bank statements, notebook entries, the Martinez letter he'd never received. And tonight I decided it was time for the ultimate retribution, he concluded his story. I broke into their house, waited for them to return, and forced them to confess everything before I killed them. Did you write down their confession? Garrison asked. No, I didn't think about it. At that moment, it was enough for me to hear the truth from their lips. The detective silently made a note in her notebook. Where did you get the weapons? I had contacts, through Thomas. Hugo didn't want to frame anyone in particular. I acquired it on the black market. Do you understand, Mr. Dickens, that even if everything you've told me is true, it doesn't justify a double murder? I realize that, Detective. I'm not looking for an excuse. I knew what I was getting into, and I was prepared for the consequences. Garrison opened the folder she'd brought with her. We've begun to examine the evidence you left at the crime scene. At first glance, they look convincing, but it's going to take us a while to confirm everything. I have time, Hugo grinned bitterly. Now I have my whole life behind bars ahead of me. Don't jump to conclusions, Mr. Dickens. The law is complex, and much will depend on the circumstances of the case. The interrogation continued for several hours. Garrison asked detailed questions about every aspect of Hugo's story, searching carefully for contradictions or inconsistencies. But there were none. Hugo was telling the truth, the whole truth, and the detective could feel it. That's enough for today, she finally said, turning off the recorder. You will be taken to your cell. We'll continue tomorrow. The next few days passed in a strange daze. Hugo answered the investigators' questions, gave statements, signed protocols. He pleaded guilty to the murders of Rosalind and David, but insisted that he had not acted in a fit of madness, but out of a desire for justice. Meanwhile, Detective Garrison was conducting her own investigation. She accessed the old Martinez murder case and found many inconsistencies and procedural irregularities. Rosalind and David's testimony was full of details that didn't add up to the case file. Hugo's attorney really conducted the defense out of hand, failing to check basic facts and failing to call key witnesses. The most important discovery was the discovery made during the search of Rosalind and David's home. In a hiding place hidden in the bedroom wall, detectives found an old cell phone. It contained text messages from 10 years ago, correspondence between David and a man named Kay, discussing the details of Martinez's murder and the framing of X. The last message from Kay demanded additional payment for making the job harder. A review of bank records confirmed that David withdrew a large amount of cash from his account during the period in question, and a review of phone records showed that on the day of Martinez's murder, Rosalind spoke to him minutes before his death, although she claimed at trial that she did not communicate with him that day. On the 5th day after Hugo's arrest, Detective Garrison came to interview him again. This time, her face looked less stern, and her eyes read something akin to sympathy. Mr. Dickens, we have news, she began. We have found further evidence to support your story. A phone with messages between David and the alleged killer, bank records, inconsistencies in Rosalind's testimony. Hugo nodded slowly. I'm glad the truth finally came out, although it's no longer going to give me 10 years of my life back. We also contacted Thomas Green at the prison. He confirmed your story and provided additional information about Carlos Vasquez. It appears he was indeed hired to kill Martinez and died under suspicious circumstances shortly thereafter. I knew that was the case, Hugo said quietly. Garrison was silent for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Mr. Dickens, I must be frank with you. All this evidence does not negate the fact that you committed a double murder. It is a serious crime, and the law is inexorable in such cases. I understand, Detective, I don't expect leniency. But, she continued, given the circumstances, the prosecutor may consider reducing the charge. Instead of first-degree murder, which means life in prison without parole, you could be charged with second-degree murder, or even manslaughter. Hugo raised a surprised look at her. Why? I've made no secret of the fact that I planned their murder. It was a cold-blooded, premeditated act. Mitigating circumstances, Mr. Dickens. 10 years of unjust imprisonment, psychological trauma, betrayal by loved ones. The court may take that into account. What do you think, Detective? Hugo asked suddenly. Garrison hesitated to answer. The question touched on her personal attitude toward a case that professional ethics demanded she keep out of the way. But in the eyes of the man sitting before her, she saw not a cold-blooded killer, but the victim of a monstrous injustice. I think the system has failed you, Mr. Dickens, she finally replied. You should have gotten a fair trial 10 years ago. The guilty should have been punished. That you took justice into your own hands was wrong in the eyes of the law, but I can understand your motives. Thank you for your honesty. Hugo smiled weakly. But I must also follow the letter of the law, Garrison added. My job is to gather all the evidence and present it to the court. It will be up to the jury to decide your fate. I'm prepared for any verdict. In the following weeks, the Hugo Dickens case captured the public's attention. The media picked up the story of a man who served 10 years for a crime he didn't commit and then took revenge on those who framed him. Opinions were divided. Some saw him as a hero who had restored justice, while others saw him as a cold-blooded killer who had no right to decide the fate of others. The prosecutor's office, under the pressure of public opinion and taking into account the new circumstances of the case, agreed to reduce the charge to second-degree murder. This meant the possibility of parole after serving a certain amount of time. Hugo's court-appointed lawyer suggested a defense strategy based on temporary insanity or extreme emotional provocation, but Hugo declined. I was in my right mind when I decided to kill them, he said. I will not hide behind psychological diagnoses. I made a choice, and I am ready to answer for it. The trial began 2 months after the murder. Detective Garrison was the prosecution's star witness, but her testimony was remarkably restrained. She presented all the facts, all the evidence, but refrained from moralizing about the defendant's actions. When it was Hugo's turn to testify, the courtroom was full. He spoke calmly, without emotion, describing in detail everything that had happened to him over the past 10 years. His account of betrayal, of the years he spent in prison, of his gradual realization of the truth, made many of the jurors lower their eyes. I'm not asking for leniency, he finished his statement. I knew what I was doing and I was prepared for the consequences, but I want everyone to know the truth. I did not kill George Martinez. He was murdered by Rosalind Dickens and David Collins by the hands of a hired assassin to take possession of the money Martinez bequeathed to me and to get rid of me. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. They found Hugo guilty of second-degree murder, which meant the possibility of parole in 15 years. After the verdict was announced, the judge asked Hugo to stand. Mr. Dickens, the law does not allow me to justify your actions, whatever the circumstances. Murder remains murder. But I can recognize that you have been the victim of a terrible injustice. The system that was supposed to protect you has failed you, and that is a sad fact that I must take into account in sentencing you. The judge sentenced Hugo to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. As the hearing ended and Hugo was being led away from the courtroom, Detective Garrison approached him. Mr. Dickens, she said quietly, I want you to know that we have filed a motion to reconsider the Martinez case. Your name will be officially cleared from the charges of his murder." "Thank you, Detective," Hugo replied. "That means a lot to me. You can petition for compensation for the years you spent in prison on false charges. It won't give you back the time you lost, but—" "Money was never the goal," Hugo interrupted her. "All I wanted was the truth, and now it is known." Garrison nodded understandingly. "Good luck to you, Mr. Dickens." "You too, Detective. Thank you for your honesty." On the way to the jail, Hugo stared out the window of the motorcade at the streets of Allentown floating by. The city that had once been his home now seemed foreign. Too much had changed, both in the outside world and within himself. He thought of Rosalind and David, of their betrayal and his revenge. Did he feel satisfaction in what he had done? Yes, partly. Justice, as he saw it, had been done. But he also felt an emptiness. Revenge didn't bring back the lost years, didn't heal the wounds of betrayal. It simply put an end to a story that should never have begun. Hugo knew he had many years in prison ahead of him, but those years would be different now. He was no longer an innocent victim of circumstance. He had made his choice and accepted its consequences. And there was freedom in that decision. Freedom from hatred, from revenge, from the past. As the truck pulled up to the gates of the prison, Hugo felt a strange calmness. For the first time in years, he could breathe without feeling the weight of an unjust accusation. Yes, he would be behind bars again. Yes, he would pay a heavy price for his actions. But the truth was known. His name was cleared of false accusations, and that knowledge gave him the strength to face the future. "I'm ready," he said to the guard who opened the door of the motorcade. The prison gates closed behind him, cutting him off from the outside world. But Hugo knew that one day they would open again, and then he would begin a new chapter of his life, without hatred, without a thirst for revenge, with a clear conscience of a man who defended his truth. Detective Lucia Garrison stood at the window of her office, watching the rain drumming on the glass. The Hugo Dickens case was closed, but it left a strange sense of incompleteness in her soul. As a policeman, she believed in law and order, in the justice system. But as a human being, she understood the pain and despair that had led Hugo to his terrible decision. In her desk drawer lay the George Martinez Review Report. The official conclusion: Hugo Dickens was innocent. 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and the real killers lived free all that time, enjoying the fruits of their crime. Had she been in his shoes, would she have acted differently? Garrison didn't know the answer to that question. And perhaps it was this ignorance that was most disturbing. The rain intensified, turning the city outside the window into a blur. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray shroud, life went on. People went about their business, unaware of the dramas that played out behind closed doors. The decisions that ordinary people sometimes had to make when cornered by circumstances. Garrison returned to her desk and opened a new folder. Life went on, and so did her work.